Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when your GPS was a camel's sense of direction. Your credit card was a pouch of silver coins, okay? And your biggest worry wasn't bad Wi-Fi, it was whether the guy selling you premium silk had actually just dyed some cotton threads and hoped you wouldn't notice until you were 3 desert crossings away. Picture this: dusty trading posts where the air shimmers with heat and the scent of exotic spices, where merchants in flowing robes gesture dramatically over bolts of fabric that might be worth a fortune or might unravel the moment you wash them. You're about to dive into a world where fortunes were made and lost faster than you could say that's not real saffron, and where every handshake is potentially the beginning of either a beautiful friendship or an elaborate con game. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Rye, love seeing how this little bedtime story travels around the globe. Much like the merchants we're about to meet. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of Ctesiphon, some magnificent Persian capital. Sometime around 550 CE, the morning sun casts long shadows across the bustling marketplace, and you can already smell trouble brewing, the kind that comes with easy money and questionable ethics. You're about to witness the birth of what historians would later call the Silk Road, though the Persian merchants around you would probably call it the greatest business opportunity since someone figured out how to ferment grapes. Meet Rostam, the resourceful, a Persian trader whose family has been in the textile business for 3 generations. Rostam has just discovered something that would make any modern entrepreneur weep with envy. The Chinese have this incredible fabric called silk that's softer than a baby's whisper and more valuable than gold. The problem? Getting it requires a journey that would make your worst airport layover look like a spa vacation. But Rostam isn't deterred. He's already calculating profit margins in his head, while his competitors are still figuring out which end of a camel to approach first. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean morally questionable. Rostam quickly realizes that most of his customers back home have never actually seen real Chinese silk. They just know it's supposed to be amazing. So naturally, Rostam begins to wonder, what if he could create something that looked and felt similar but cost a fraction of the price to produce? It's like the ancient equivalent of those designer handbags you see in certain markets that are definitely, absolutely, 100% authentic Louis Vuitton, according to the very convincing certificate printed on regular paper. Rostam starts small, mixing genuine silk with threads made from wild silkworms found in Persian forests. The result is pretty convincing, especially if you don't look too closely or, more importantly, if you don't know what you're looking for. He brands it as Persian imperial silk and sells it at a 300% markup to wealthy families in Baghdad, who are desperate to keep up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Ibn-Amads. But Rostam isn't the only one having bright ideas. All across Persia, traders are developing their own creative interpretations of premium goods. There's Cyrus, the creative, who's discovered that if you take regular wool and soak it in a mixture of saffron and rosewater, it develops a sheen that's almost silk-like in certain lighting conditions. Historians still debate whether Cyrus was genuinely trying to create a silk alternative, or if he just stumbled upon this technique after a particularly messy dinner party, but the results speak for themselves. Then there's Darius, the daring, who's taken a different approach entirely. Instead of creating fake silk, he's focused on creative labeling. His Silk Road special is actually made from cotton, but he's not technically lying. It is special, and it did travel along what would become the Silk Road. It's the kind of marketing genius that would make modern advertising executives either applaud or file a lawsuit, cuting on their mood. The beauty of these early schemes is their simplicity. There's no internet for fact-checking, no consumer protection agencies, and definitely no Yelp reviews. If someone buys your premium silk and discovers 3 months later that it's actually cotton with delusions of grandeur, what are they going to do? File a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. The closest thing to customer service is hoping the merchant hasn't fled to another city entirely. What makes these Persian pioneers particularly clever is how they've turned necessity into opportunity. The genuine Silk Road journey is genuinely dangerous bandits, sandstorms, political upheavals, and the constant risk that your entire caravan might get lost because someone misread the stars. But instead of seeing these challenges as obstacles, the Persians have realized they're actually selling features. This silk is so exclusive, they tell their customers that people literally risked their lives to obtain it. It's not false advertising, if it's technically true, right? The ripple effects of these early entrepreneurial experiments are already spreading. Persian nobles are hosting dinner parties where they casually mention their new silk purchases, not realizing they're essentially having a competition to see who can be the most successfully deceived. It's like a whole society playing an elaborate game of retail telephone, where each person is both the victim and perpetrator of increasingly creative interpretations of truth. And here's the thing that will probably keep modern historians up at night. These weren't necessarily bad people, They were innovators, risk takers, the kind of individuals who saw opportunity where others saw only problems. They just happened to be innovating in an era where consumer protection laws were more like consumer protection suggestions, and ethical business practices were whatever you could sleep at night doing. You fast forward about 2 centuries, and now you're standing in the heart of Samarkand, crown jewel of Central Asia and what could only be described as the Las Vegas of the medieval world. If Las Vegas had been built around camel parking and featured significantly more sword-wielding security guards, the year is roughly 750 CE, and this city has become the ultimate destination for merchants who've made it big and want everyone to know it. Picture the most over-the-top display of wealth you can imagine, then add silk pavilions, golden goblets, the size of your head, and enough exotic animals to stock a zoo. The ruler of Samarkand, remarkably forward-thinking fellow named Gurak, has figured out something that modern casino owners would absolutely appreciate. If you want people to spend money recklessly, you need to create an environment where normal rules don't seem to apply. Gurak has essentially turned his entire city into one massive hospitality experience, complete with legendary feasts, entertainment that would make Broadway jealous, and business deals that get negotiated over increasingly elaborate drinking games. You witness one of these legendary merchant gatherings, and honestly, it makes your company's holiday party look like a book club meeting. There's Mahmud the Magnificent, Sogdian trader who's just completed a successful silk run from Chang'an to Constantinople. He's celebrating by hosting a banquet that features peacocks stuffed with smaller birds, which are stuffed with even smaller birds, creating what could only be described as a medieval turducken situation. The wine flows freely. Musicians perform on instruments made from precious metals, and somewhere in the background, a poet is composing verses about the superior quality of maymus. Merchandise verses that may or may not be entirely factual. But here's where the Vegas comparison becomes eerily accurate. Just like modern gamblers who hit it big and immediately start making questionable decisions, these successful merchants often leave Samarkand significantly less wealthy than they arrived. Take Hassan the Hopeful, a spice trader from Isfahan, who showed up with a caravan full of genuine saffron. After 3 days of Gurak's hospitality, Hassan has somehow agreed to invest his entire profit margin in a scheme involving trained dancing bears and a revolutionary new type of waterproof silk that definitely, absolutely works, according to the very convincing demonstration he saw while heavily influenced by fermented mare's milk. The really brilliant part of Samarkand's operation is how they've made excessive spending seem like a cultural obligation. Merchants don't just buy goods here. They buy status, reputation, and bragging rights. There's an entire social hierarchy based on how extravagantly you can afford to lose money, and everyone's desperately trying to out-ridiculous each other. It's like keeping up with the Kardashians, except the Kardashians are medieval merchants, and instead of designer handbags, they're competing over who can afford the most impractical caravan accessories. You observe one particularly spectacular example of this competitive spending when two Byzantine merchants get into what can only be described as a purchase-off. It starts when Marcus the Modest, a nickname that hasn't aged well, mentions that he's bought some nice Chinese porcelain. Not to be outdone, Thaddeus the Theatrical immediately purchases an entire dinner set made from jade, complete with serving platters that require 3 men to lift. Marcus responds by buying a tent made entirely from silk threads, so fine they're practically invisible. Thaddeus counters with a camel that's been trained to perform mathematical calculations, which sounds impressive until you realize the camel can only add numbers up to 3. And even then, only on Tuesdays. Historians still debate whether the merchants of Samarkand were genuinely trying to conduct serious business, or if they just got caught up in the world's most expensive shopping competition. But the results speak for themselves. The city's bazaars became legendary, not just for their selection, but for their ability to two separate wealthy visitors from their money with style and panache. The local merchants have developed what could generously be called creative pricing strategies. There's the foreigner tax, which is exactly what it sounds like. There's the complexity surcharge, applied to any transaction that requires more than basic arithmetic. And there's the prestige premium, which is essentially charging extra for the privilege of overpaying for something. It's like those resort fees at fancy hotels, except instead of wireless internet, you're paying extra for the social status of being the kind of person who shops in Samarkand. But perhaps it's the most ingenious aspect of Samarkand's merchant culture is how they've turned haggling into performance art. Negotiations don't just involve price discussions. They involve dramatic speeches, appeals to family honor, references to ancient treaties between distant kingdoms, and occasionally interpretive dance. A simple transaction for a bolt of silk can turn into a 3-hour theatrical production that would win awards if awards existed for most creative retail experience. The city has also pioneered what modern marketers would recognize as the exclusive club approach. Certain merchants will only sell to customers who've been personally recommended by previous buyers, creating an artificial scarcity that makes people want to buy things simply because they're not supposed to be able to. It's like having a velvet rope around a tent full of overpriced textiles, and somehow this makes people want to get inside even more desperately. The most successful Samarkand merchants have realized that they're not really selling products, they're selling stories. When someone buys a piece of dragon silk, which is probably just regular silk with a really good marketing campaign, they're not just purchasing fabric, they're buying the story of brave merchants who allegedly wrestled dragons for their silk-producing capabilities. Never mind that dragons aren't real. The story makes the silk feel more valuable, and in a world where perception often matters more than reality, that's pure genius. You shift your attention to Constantinople around 550 CE, where you're about to witness what historians would later call either the greatest heist in ancient history or the world's first successful case of industrial espionage, depending on whether you're feeling charitable toward the perpetrators. The Byzantine Empire has a problem that would make any modern CEO break out in a cold sweat. They're completely dependent on Chinese silk, but they have absolutely no idea how it's made, and the Chinese are guarding that secret like it's the formula for Coca-Cola. Emperor Justinian I is particularly frustrated by this situation. Every year, the empire spends what amounts to a small country's GDP importing silk from China. Okay. And every year, Justinian watches his treasury drain like a bathtub with a broken plug. He's tried negotiating better trade deals, he's attempted to find alternative suppliers, and he's even considered declaring war on fashion itself, but nothing has worked. The Chinese silk monopoly is more secure than Fort Knox, and everyone knows it. Enter two monks whose names have been lost to history, but whose actions would change the course of international commerce forever. Let's call them Brother Sneaky and Brother Ingenious, because those are probably more accurate than whatever their actual names were. These two had spent considerable time in China, officially spreading Christianity, but unofficially developing what could generously be called unhealthy curiosity about local manufacturing processes. Here's where the story gets wonderfully absurd. Brother Sneaky and Brother Ingenious have figured out that silk comes from silkworms, not from some mystical Chinese silk trees, as many Byzantines believed. More importantly, they have realized that if they could somehow smuggle some silkworm eggs back to Constantinople, they could start their own silk production and break China's stranglehold on the market. It's like discovering that Kentucky Fried Chicken's secret recipe is actually written down somewhere, and all you need to do is figure out how to steal it without getting caught. The problem, of course, is that the Chinese authorities are extremely serious about protecting their silk monopoly. Anyone caught trying to export silkworms, eggs, or even detailed information about silk production faces penalties that make modern corporate non-disclosure agreements look like gentle suggestions. We're talking about consequences that would make you fondly remember the good old days when the worst thing that could happen was getting a stern talking to from your boss. But our two monks have come up with a plan that's either brilliantly simple or simply insane. They're going to hide silkworm eggs inside their walking sticks. Picture this: two holy men dressed in modest robes, carrying what appear to be perfectly ordinary bamboo walking sticks, strolling casually through Chinese customs like they're on a pleasant hiking trip. Meanwhile, their walking sticks contain what amounts to the biological equivalent of state secrets. The journey back to Constantinople takes months, and you can imagine the stress levels involved. Every customs checkpoint becomes a potential disaster. Every suspicious look from a border guard could mean the end of not just their mission, but their lives, essentially carrying the ancient world's equivalent of stolen nuclear technology, hidden inside what looks like hiking equipment. It's like being in a spy movie, except the spies are monks and the secret weapon is insects. Historians still debate whether the monks fully understood the implications of what they were doing, or if they just thought they were pulling off a clever bit of entrepreneurship. The Chinese silk industry represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, generations of careful breeding techniques, and trade secrets that had been closely guarded for over 1,000 years. Our two monks were essentially walking off with the foundation of China's most valuable export industry hidden inside some bamboo tubes. The really remarkable part is that it worked. The silkworm eggs survived the journey. The monks made it back to Constantinople without getting caught, and Emperor Justinian suddenly found himself in possession of the means to start his own silk industry. It's like if someone managed to steal the recipe for semiconductors, and suddenly your garage startup could compete with major tech companies. The immediate impact was enormous. Within a few years, Byzantine silk production was ramping up, prices were dropping, and the Chinese monopoly was effectively broken. The economic implications rippled across the entire known world. Trade routes shifted, political alliances changed, and suddenly, every merchant from Spain to India had to recalculate their business models. But here's the part that would make modern corporate lawyers weep. There were no international patent laws, no trade dispute resolution mechanisms, and definitely no World Trade Organization to file complaints with. The Chinese couldn't exactly sue for intellectual property theft, because the legal framework for such concepts didn't exist yet, They could be furious about it, and they were, but their legal options were essentially limited to writing very stern letters and hoping someone would pay attention. The monks themselves seemed to have faded into obscurity after completing their mission, which is probably exactly what they wanted. They'd essentially pulled off the heist of the millennium and managed to retire quietly before anyone could. They got exactly how much trouble they were potentially in. It's the kind of exit strategy that modern whistleblowers could only dream of. The long-term consequences of this silkworm smuggling operation were staggering. European silk production flourished, new trade routes developed, and the entire economic balance of power between East and West shifted. All because 2 monks figured out how to hide some bug eggs in their walking sticks and had the nerve to actually go through with it. You find yourself in the bustling commercial district of Damascus around 800 CE, where you're about to discover that some of history's most successful merchants never actually left their home cities. They just got really, really good at creative storytelling and what we'd now call virtual business management. Meet Abdul Rahman, the inventive, a man whose greatest talent isn't riding camels across dangerous deserts, but rather convincing other people that he definitely, absolutely has been riding camels across dangerous deserts on their behalf. Abdul Rahman has developed what could charitably be called an innovative business model. Instead of actually organizing caravans, purchasing goods, and risking life and limb on the Silk Road, he simply tells potential investors that he's going to do all those things, takes their money, waits an appropriate amount of time for a real caravan to make the journey, then returns with stories of adventure and small samples of exotic goods that he's actually purchased from local merchants who did make the trip. The genius of Abdul Rahman's operation lies in his attention to detail. He doesn't just show up after 6 months claiming to have been in China. He arrives with carefully crafted evidence. His clothes are appropriately weathered, he sports a convincing tan, and he's developed an impressive collection of bandits try to rob us scars that are actually from increasingly creative household accidents. He's like a method actor, except instead of preparing for a role, he's preparing for a felony. But Abdul Rahman isn't working alone. It's part of what historians would probably call a merchant collective if they were being polite, or a sophisticated fraud ring if they were being honest. There's Ibrahim the imaginative, who specializes in creating false documentation bills of sale, customs papers, and letters from grateful customers in distant cities. Ibrahim has developed a whole artistic style around aged paper and believable looking official seals, turning forgery into something approaching fine art. Then there's Yusuf the yarner. His job is to create compelling backstories for their imaginary adventures. Yusuf has an impressive talent for spinning tales that are just believable enough to be convincing, but just exciting enough to be memorable. His stories typically involve narrow escapes from bandits, chance encounters with exotic princesses, and fortuitous discoveries of rare goods in unlikely places. He's basically writing adventure novels, except his audience thinks they're hearing genuine travel reports. The really clever part of this operation is how they've turned the Silk Roads genuine dangers into a marketing advantage. When real merchants return from actual journeys with stories of hardship and loss, Abdul Rahman's group simply incorporates those details into their own fictional narratives. It's like having a ready-made library of authentic experiences that they can borrow, modify, and claim as their own. You witness one of Abdul Rahman's return ceremonies, where he presents his findings to eager investors. He's got silk that he claims came from the personal workshops of the Chinese emperor silk that actually came from a local merchant who bought it from someone who bought it from someone who might have actually been to China at some point. He's got spices that allegedly grew in secret gardens, guarded by fierce warrior spices that actually came from the Damascus spice market. With creative labeling applied, the investors are completely convinced. Why wouldn't they be? Abdul Rahman has all the right props, all the right stories, and most importantly, he has genuine products to show for his alleged efforts. The fact that these products cost him significantly less than what his investors contributed is just good business sense, right? But perhaps the most audacious part of this whole operation is how they've created fake competitors. Ibrahim has developed multiple merchant personas, complete with different names, backgrounds, and specialties. Sometimes Abdul Rahman will mention that his rival, Hakim the Hasty, is also planning a journey to the same region, creating artificial urgency and competition. Investors start bidding against each other for the privilege of funding Abdul Rahman's expeditions, not realizing that Hakim the Hasty exists only in Ibrahim's impressively creative imagination. The success of these phantom merchants has created what economists would now recognize as a bubble market. Legitimate merchants are having trouble finding investors because everyone wants to fund the exciting expeditions that promise enormous returns and thrilling stories. Meanwhile, the phantom merchants are getting rich while never leaving their comfortable homes in Damascus. Historians still debate whether operations like Abdul Rahman's were actually harmful to long-term trade development, or whether they served a useful function by keeping money circulating in the local economy while real merchants were away on genuine expeditions. It's like asking whether fictional entertainment is bad for society. Because it's not real, the answer probably depends on whether people understand they're consuming fiction. The most remarkable aspect of these phantom caravan operations is their longevity. Some of these groups operated for decades, building loyal customer bases and establishing reputations that outlasted many legitimate merchants. They were providing something their customers genuinely wanted: exciting stories, exotic goods, and the feeling of participating in grand adventures, even if the adventures themselves were largely imaginary. Of course, eventually, some of these operations were exposed. Usually, when a real merchant returned from a journey and mentioned never having met the famous Abdul Rahman, despite allegedly traveling the same routes at the same time. But by then, many of the phantom merchants had accumulated enough wealth to either retire quietly or transition into legitimate trading operations, having essentially learned the business through creative simulation rather than actual experience. You arrived in Kashgar around 900 CE at what could only be described as the ultimate crossroads of creative commerce, where lying about prices had been elevated to such an art form that even the professional liars needed translators to keep track of who was deceiving whom about what. This oasis city sits perfectly positioned where the northern and southern routes of the Silk Road converge, making it the kind of place where every merchant, translator, money changer, and camel groomer had developed their own sophisticated system for extracting maximum profit from confused travelers. The beauty of Kashgar's location is that merchants arriving from different directions often had completely different ideas about what things should cost. A Chinese trader coming from the east might think Central Asian carpets are incredibly expensive, while a Persian merchant arriving from the west might consider them surprisingly affordable. Local Kashgar merchants had figured out how to exploit these price perception differences with the precision of modern hedge fund managers. You observe the legendary bizarre negotiations, and honestly, they make modern car dealership tactics look like children's games. There's Akbar, the artful, local carpet merchant who's developed what could generously be called a flexible pricing strategy. When a Chinese merchant approaches, Akbar explains that carpets are incredibly rare and valuable because they have to be transported across dangerous mountain passes. When a Persian merchant shows interest in the same carpet an hour later, Akbar mentions that prices are surprisingly low because of a recent surplus in local production. The carpet itself hasn't changed, but somehow its perceived value has fluctuated more than RYPTOCURRENCY. But the real genius of Kashgar's commercial ecosystem lies in its translator network. These aren't just people who convert languages. They're essentially commission-based sales associates who get paid based on how much their clients spend. You watch Mamada, multilingual, as he translates a negotiation between a Sogdian spice trader and a Byzantine silk merchant. When the Sogdian says his spices cost a reasonable amount, Mahmud translates this as an incredible bargain that won't last long. When the Byzantine mentions he's interested in making a purchase, Mahmud translates this as desperately eager and willing to pay premium prices. The most sophisticated scam you witness involves what local merchants call the authenticity verification service. Ahmad, the authenticator, has positioned himself as an expert who can confirm whether goods are genuine or fake. For a small fee, he'll examine any item and provide an official-looking certificate of authenticity. What buyers don't realize is that Ahmad has a financial arrangement with several merchants. He gets a percentage of sales for any item he authenticates, which means his expert opinion is influenced by some very inexpert motivations. The money changing situation in Kashgar has evolved into something that would make modern foreign exchange traders weep with envy. There are at least 12 different currencies in regular circulation, okay? And the exchange rates seem to change based on factors including the time of day, okay, the phase of the moon, and whether the money changer had a good breakfast. You watch Omar, the opportunistic, as he quotes completely different exchange rates to customers standing just 3 feet apart from each other, somehow managing to make profitable trades in both directions simultaneously. Perhaps the most creative price manipulation technique involves what merchants call the caravan premium. Any goods that have allegedly traveled with famous or successful caravans automatically cost more, even if they're identical to goods that traveled with unknown caravans. There's a thriving market in fake caravan documentation where merchants can purchase certificates proving their goods traveled with the legendary expedition of Hakim the Heroic, or the famous journey of Saladin. The successful expeditions may or may not have actually existed. The competition between Kashgar merchants has led to increasingly elaborate pricing strategies. There's the foreign dignitary discount, which is actually a markup disguised as a special deal. There's the bulk purchase bonus, where buying more items somehow costs more per item than buying fewer items. Through mathematical calculations that will confuse professional accountants. And there's the friendship price, which is invariably higher than the regular price because, as merchants explain, okay, friends deserve the very best quality goods. Local authorities have attempted to regulate some of these practices, but enforcement is complicated by the fact that many of the officials responsible for market oversight are also merchants themselves, creating conflicts of interest that would make modern ethics committees have nervous breakdowns. The market inspector might fine a merchant for overcharging in the morning, then buy goods from the same merchant in the afternoon, using insider knowledge about which items are actually worth purchasing. Historians still debate whether Kashgar's elaborate pricing system was economically efficient or just an incredibly complex way of redistributing wealth from confused travelers to clever locals. But there's no denying its creativity. The city had essentially turned commerce into performance art, where every transaction was a negotiation, every negotiation was a performance, and every performance was designed to separate customers from as much money as possible while keeping them happy enough to recommend the experience to other potential victims. The most remarkable aspect of Kashgar's commercial culture is how it managed to maintain its reputation as a fair and trustworthy trading center. Despite these elaborate deception systems, merchants would return home with stories of successful deals and exotic discoveries, never quite realizing that they'd paid premium prices for goods that were available much cheaper just a few stalls away. It's like everyone was having such a good time being creatively deceived that they didn't mind the deception, or maybe they just never figured it out. Remember that prototor solar, de estico, de crocodilo from those early Persian merchants? Well, in Kashgar, that same product would somehow be marketed as both traditional Chinese medicine and exclusive Persian luxury treatment, depending on which customer was asking about it. You venture deeper into the shadowy world of Silk Road commerce, where you discover an entire underground economy built around what merchants politely called ingredient optimization, okay? And what everyone else would recognize as sophisticated food fraud by 950 CE. The spice trade had become so lucrative that creative entrepreneurs had turned adulterating expensive seasonings to a science more precise than medieval alchemy. The epicenter of this aromatic deception was the great spice market of Trebizond, where you encounter Khalil the Creative, a spice merchant whose talents would make modern food scientists either applaud or call the authorities. Khalil had figured out that most customers couldn't actually tell the difference between genuine saffron and a carefully crafted mixture of safflower petals, turmeric powder, and a secret ingredient that he claimed was the essence of Persian sunshine, but which was actually just finely ground marigold flowers. The saffron scam was particularly ingenious because real saffron was worth more than its weight in gold, making it the perfect target for creative substitution. Khalil would purchase small amounts of genuine saffron to use as samples, allowing customers to smell and taste the real thing before purchasing larger quantities of his premium saffron blend. By the time buyers discovered the deception they ever did, their caravans were usually hundreds of miles away, making returns somewhat impractical. But Khalil was a small-time operator compared to Nasir, the ingenious, who had developed what could only be described as a spice counterfeiting empire. Nasir had figured out how to replicate not just the appearance and taste of expensive spices, but also their weight, texture, and even their behavior when cooked. His fake black pepper was made from ground juniper berries mixed with charcoal, dust, and a binding agent that made the mixture stick together like real peppercorns. The result was so convincing that even experienced cooks couldn't tell the difference until they tried to grind it themselves. The cinnamon situation had become particularly absurd. There were at least 7 different substances being sold as genuine Ceylon cinnamon in various markets, ranging from actual cinnamon bark to creative combinations of tree bark, sawdust, and aromatic oils. Merchants had developed elaborate stories about their sources' secret groves guarded by fierce tribes, exclusive trading relationships with mysterious mountain dwellers, and harvesting techniques passed down through generations of cinnamon masters. You witness one particularly spectacular example of spice fraud when a Byzantine merchant named Gregorios purchases what he believes to be dragon's breath pepper, allegedly the hottest spice in the world, harvested from plants that grow in volcanic soil. The merchant selling this miraculous seasoning, Abdullah the Theatrical, provides an elaborate demonstration of the pepper's potency by dramatically pretending to faint after smelling a small sample. What Gregorios doesn't realize is that dragon's breath pepper is actually just regular black pepper mixed with ground dried chilies and a small amount of genuine hot pepper, hot enough to be impressive, but not so hot as to be dangerous. The spice fraud industry had developed its own elaborate quality control systems. There were professional spice testers who would certify the authenticity of various seasonings, but many of these testers were secretly employed by the merchants whose products they were supposedly evaluating independently. It's like having restaurant critics who are secretly owned by restaurant owners. The reviews might be enthusiastic, but they're not exactly unbiased. Perhaps the most creative spice scam involved what merchants call enhancement services. A customer could purchase regular spices and then pay extra to have them enhanced with special treatments that supposedly improve their potency and flavor. The enhancement process typically involves storing the spices in containers with small amounts of genuine, expensive seasonings, allowing the cheaper spices to absorb some authentic aromas. It's like dry cleaning for food. Technically, a service was being provided, even if the results were somewhat questionable. The competition between spice adulterators had led to increasingly sophisticated techniques. Some merchants were adding ground rice to extend expensive spices, while others were using natural dyes to make cheap spices look like expensive ones. There were specialists who focused on texture modification, others who specialized in aroma enhancement, and a few who had developed techniques for adding artificial weight to make small quantities of genuine spices feel like larger amounts. Local authorities occasionally attempted to crack down on spice fraud, but enforcement was complicated by the fact that many officials couldn't tell authentic spices from fake ones either. There were highly publicized raids on suspected adulterators, but these often resulted in the confiscation of perfectly legitimate spices while the real fraudsters continued operating with impunity. It's like trying to enforce copyright laws. When you can't read, you might catch some violators, but you're probably missing most of them. Historians still debate whether the widespread spice adulteration actually improved or harmed international trade, but there's no denying its impact on culinary culture. Cooks across Europe and Asia began developing recipes that were less dependent on specific, expensive spices, leading to more creative and diverse cooking techniques. In a weird way, spice fraud may have actually encouraged culinary innovation by forcing chefs to be more resourceful. The most remarkable aspect of the medieval spice fraud industry was its longevity. Some of these deception techniques continued for centuries, passing from father to son, like family traditions. By the time maritime trade routes began to make spices more accessible and affordable, many regions had developed entire culinary traditions based on recipes that had been adapted to work with creatively adulterated seasonings. You step into the sophisticated world of diplomatic commerce around 1000 CE, we discover that some of history's most respected ambassadors and diplomatic envoys were essentially running elaborate smuggling operations under the cover of international relations. These weren't just merchants pretending to be diplomats. These were actual diplomats who had figured out that diplomatic immunity made for excellent business opportunities. Meet Envoy Hassan al-Diplomatic, officially the Byzantine Empire's ambassador to the Abbasid Caliphate, but unofficially one of the most successful contraband entrepreneurs of his era. Hassan had realized that diplomatic pouches were never searched by customs officials. Diplomatic caravans traveled with military escorts that bandits avoided, and diplomatic residences were considered sovereign territory where local trade laws didn't necessarily apply. It's like having a get-out-of-jail-free card for international commerce, except the jail is customs enforcement, and the card is a fancy diplomatic credential. The beauty of Hassan's operation was its legitimacy cover. When he traveled between Constantinople and Baghdad on official diplomatic business, his caravan would include the usual diplomatic necessities for foreign dignitaries, official documents, ceremonial items, but also a carefully curated selection of high-value trade goods hidden among the legitimate diplomatic cargo. His ceremonial silk tapestries were actually premium merchandise destined for private buyers. His gifts of goodwill were pre-sold items that recipients had already paid for through intermediaries. But Hassan wasn't the only diplomat with entrepreneurial instincts. There was Ambassador Zara, the resourceful, officially representing the Fatimid Caliphate in various Central Asian courts, but unofficially operating what could generously be called an international acquisition service. Zara had developed relationships with craftsmen and merchants throughout her diplomatic territory, essentially creating a network of suppliers who provided her with exclusive access to regional specialties. When she returned from diplomatic missions, cultural exchange samples and educational materials would somehow find their way to the hands of wealthy collectors who had mysteriously placed orders months in advance. The most audacious example of diplomatic commerce involved Prince Vladimir the Versatile, a minor Russian noble who had managed to get himself appointed as a roving ambassador to various Silk Road cities. Vladimir's diplomatic credentials were somewhat questionable. Historians still debate whether some of the kingdoms he claimed to represent actually existed, but his paperwork looked official enough to impress border guards and customs officials. His specialty was royal acquisitions, where he would purchase valuable items on behalf of various European courts, except many of these purchases were actually speculative investments that he hoped to sell at significant markups. The gift-giving aspect of diplomacy had evolved into something that would make modern ethics committees break out in cold sweats. Diplomatic protocol required ambassadors to exchange valuable gifts with their hosts, but the definition of gift had become remarkably flexible. You witness one exchange where Hassan presents the Caliph with a token of Byzantine friendship, a beautiful silk robe that the Caliph admires greatly. What the Caliph doesn't realize is that Hassan has brought 12 identical robes, which he's planning to sell as worn by the Caliph himself once he returns to Constantinople. Meanwhile, the Caliph's reciprocal gift to Hassan is a magnificent jewel dagger that Hassan has actually purchased from a local craftsman, using funds provided by a Byzantine collector who specifically requested authentic Abbasid royal weapons. The most sophisticated diplomatic scams involved what ambassadors called cultural preservation projects. Envoy Marina, the scholarly, had convinced several courts that she was collecting artifacts and manuscripts for a great library that would preserve knowledge for future generations. She would obtain rare books, artistic treasures, scientific instruments through her diplomatic connections, supposedly for this noble educational purpose. The library did exist in Marina's private villa, while scholars were occasionally allowed to visit. Most of the collection spent its time being quietly sold to wealthy private collectors across Europe. Some diplomat merchants had developed elaborate authentication schemes for their goods. Ambassador Ibn Sina, the certified, would provide official diplomatic documentation certifying that items had been personally selected by diplomatic representatives or approved by royal courts. These certificates looked impressively official and carried diplomatic seals, making them perfect for convincing buyers that they were purchasing genuinely prestigious items rather than regular merchandise with fancy paperwork. The competitive aspect of diplomatic commerce had led to increasingly creative interpretations of international law. There were disputes over whether diplomatic residences could serve as retail outlets, whether diplomatic messengers could carry commercial cargo, and whether diplomatic banquets could double as trade exhibitions. Some ambassadors were essentially running luxury shopping services where wealthy clients could place orders for exotic goods that would be acquired through diplomatic channels and delivered with full diplomatic protection. Historians still debate whether these diplomatic commerce operations were beneficial or harmful to international relations, but there's no denying their effectiveness. Diplomat merchants often had better intelligence about local markets, stronger relationships with key suppliers, and more reliable transportation networks than regular traders. They were essentially creating informal trade agreements while conducting official diplomatic business. The most remarkable aspect of diplomatic commerce was how it blurred the lines between public service and private enterprise. Many of these ambassador entrepreneurs genuinely believed they were serving their countries by facilitating trade and cultural exchange, even if they were also serving themselves by accumulating personal wealth. It's like modern consulting, where former government officials leverage their connections for private gain, except with more camels and significantly less regulatory oversight. Remember Rostam, the resourceful, and his creative interpretation of silk authenticity? Well, diplomatic merchants had taken similar approaches to authenticating their goods, except now they had official government seals to make their creative descriptions seem more credible. You'll find yourself in Bukhara around 1100 CE, a city that had somehow managed to become the ancient world's equivalent of a corporate bankruptcy court. Except, instead of filing legal paperwork, merchants simply disappeared into the night with other people's money and hoped nobody would notice until they were safely established in another city several hundred miles away. This wasn't accidental. Bukhara had developed a commercial culture where breaking contracts had become so commonplace that the city's legal system had essentially given up trying to enforce merchant agreements. The root of Bukhara's problem was its success as a trading center. The city sat at the intersection of multiple trade routes, making it an ideal place for merchants to establish temporary operations, collect advance payments for future deliveries, and then vanish before anyone realized they had no intention of actually delivering anything. It's like if Las Vegas had been built around merchant fraud instead of gambling. The house always wins. But in this case, the house keeps changing ownership. You encounter Farid, the forgetful merchant who had perfected what could generously be called selective memory regarding financial obligations. Farid would arrive in Bukhara with genuine goods and legitimate credentials, establish a reputation for reliable service over several months, and then gradually begin accepting larger and larger advance payments for increasingly exotic merchandise that would supposedly arrive with future caravans. By the time customers realized that Farid's promised deliveries weren't materializing, Farid himself had mysteriously developed urgent business elsewhere that required his immediate attention. The local court system had become part of the problem rather than the solution. Judge Ibn Qasim, the pragmatic, had essentially given up trying to resolve merchant disputes, instead focusing on what he called damage mitigation, rather than attempting to enforce contracts or recover stolen goods. The court would simply document complaints and hope that public embarrassment might encourage better behavior in the future. It's like having a police department that responds to robbery reports by filing paperwork and hoping the robbers feel bad about their life choices. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Bucharest's commercial dysfunction was how it had attracted specialists in contract manipulation. There was lawyer Mahmoud, the creative, who had developed techniques for writing agreements that appeared to be binding but actually contained escape clauses, so subtle that even careful readers missed them. His contracts would specify delivery dates, weather permitting, quality standards subject to reasonable interpretation, and payment terms contingent upon market conditions, language so vague that almost any failure could be legally justified. The most spectacular example of Bucharest's contract problems involved what became known as the Great Silk Shortage of 1098. A consortium of merchants had accepted advance payments from buyers throughout Central Asia for a massive silk delivery that was supposedly coming from China. The merchants provided detailed documentation about their suppliers, showed samples of the expected merchandise, and even organized viewing parties where potential customers could examine similar goods that had allegedly arrived from previous shipments. The problem was that there was no Chinese supplier, no incoming caravan, and definitely no massive silk shipment. The entire operation was an elaborate Ponzi scheme where early investors were paid with money from later investors, creating the illusion of successful transactions, while the organizers quietly transferred the accumulated funds to secure locations outside Bucharest's jurisdiction. When the scheme finally collapsed, it took down not just the original conspirators, but dozens of legitimate merchants who had accepted what they believed were standard commercial partnerships. The aftermath of the Great Silk Shortage created a fascinating economic phenomenon. Merchants began demanding increasingly complex verification procedures for any significant transaction. There were specialists who investigated the backgrounds of trading partners, others who verified the existence of claimed suppliers, and professional witnesses who would observe contract negotiations to prevent later disputes about what had actually been agreed upon. It's like the ancient equivalent of due diligence, except the penalties for inadequate research or personal financial ruin. Rather than just embarrassing quarterly reports, local authorities attempted various reforms to restore confidence in Bucharest's commercial system. There were new regulations requiring merchants to post bonds before accepting advance payments, mandatory registration systems for trading operations, and even an early version of a credit reporting system where merchants' past performance would be documented and shared with potential partners. But enforcement remained problematic, partly because many of the officials responsible for oversight were themselves involved in questionable trading schemes. The most creative solution to Buckra's contract enforcement problems came from the merchant community itself. Groups of traders began forming mutual insurance cooperatives, where members would collectively guarantee each other's contracts. If one member defaulted on an agreement, the others would cover the losses to protect the group's reputation. Worked well in theory, but in practice, it meant that when one member of a cooperative turned out to be fraudulent, they often took down the entire group with them. Historians still debate whether Buckra's reputation for commercial unreliability was entirely deserved, or whether it was partly the result of unfair comparisons to other trading centers that had their own problems but better public relations. What's clear is that by 1100 CE, Bukhara merchant had become something of a contradiction in terms merchants from Bukhara might be perfectly honest. But they had to work extra hard to prove it because of their city's reputation. Remember those? Phantom merchants like Abdul Rahman, the inventive, who never actually traveled anywhere. Well, Bukhara had become their natural habitat, a place where creative storytelling about non-existent business ventures could flourish until reality caught up with the stories. You arrive in Isfahan around 1200 CE, where you witness the final act of the Great Silk Road trading drama city, where Persian merchants were attempting increasingly desperate and elaborate schemes as they watched their ancient overland trade routes being slowly strangled by new maritime shipping lanes that could deliver goods faster, cheaper, and with significantly less risk of being robbed by bandits or lost in sandstorms. Isfahan had become the headquarters for what could only be described as last chance commerce, where merchants who had built their entire fortunes on overland trade were trying everything they could think of to maintain their relevance in a rapidly changing economic landscape. It's like watching travel agents trying to compete with the internet, except the stakes were entire family fortunes and the consequences of failure involved considerably more poverty and public shame. You encounter Mirza Hazen, the desperate, third-generation silk merchant, whose grandfather had made a fortune on the traditional routes, and whose father had maintained the family's prosperity through creative business practices. Now Mirza Hazen was facing the reality that ships sailing around Africa could deliver Chinese silk to European markets in a fraction of the time it took his caravans to cross the mountains and deserts of Central Asia. His response was to develop what he called premium overland delivery services, essentially charging extra for the traditional dangers and delays that customers were increasingly trying to avoid. The logic behind Mirza Hazen's strategy was actually quite sophisticated. He had realized that some wealthy customers were willing to pay premium prices for goods that came with compelling stories, even if those stories involved unnecessary hardship and risk. His desert survivor silk was marketed as being tougher and more beautiful because it had endured the challenges of caravan travel. His bandit-tested spices were supposedly more flavorful because they had been protected by armed guards during dangerous mountain crossings. It's like convincing people that food tastes better when it's cooked over a campfire, except the campfire is a 6-month journey through hostile territory. But the most audacious schemes were being orchestrated by a consortium led by Ustad Ahmed, the imaginative, who had decided that if overland trade was becoming obsolete, he would simply pretend it wasn't happening. Ahmad's group had developed an elaborate system for creating artificial scarcity around overland goods, spreading rumors about maritime shipping problems, and even staging fake pirate attacks on sea routes to make ocean transport seem more dangerous than it actually was. Ahmad's operation involved bribing harbor officials in various port cities to provide reports of shipping delays, organizing concerned merchant meetings where planted participants would express worry about the reliability of sea routes, and even hiring actors to play the roles of distressed ship captains who had supposedly lost valuable cargo to storms or pirates. It's like a medieval version of market manipulation, except instead of spreading false information through financial networks, okay? They were using the ancient equivalent of word-of-mouth marketing to create false perceptions about their competition. The competition between traditional overland merchants and the new maritime traders had led to increasingly creative marketing battles. There were Isfahan merchants who claimed that goods transported by sea were contaminated by salt air. Others who insisted that the motion of ships damaged delicate fabrics. Some who argued that maritime trade was fundamentally unreliable because it depended on weather conditions that were impossible to predict or control. Meanwhile, maritime traders were arguing that overland goods were overpriced, frequently damaged by rough handling, and often adulterated by unscrupulous caravan operators. Perhaps the most desperate scheme involved what Ahmed's group called hybrid transportation services. They would purchase goods that had arrived by sea, transport them overland for a few hundred miles, and then sell them as traditionally traded merchandise with all the prestige and premium pricing that overland goods still commanded in certain markets. It's like taking a factory-made product, aging it artificially, selling it as handcrafted and tactically, not false advertising, but definitely misleading. The most tragic aspect of Isfahan's commercial decline was how it affected merchants, who had spent their entire lives mastering the complexities of overland trade. These were people who could read weather patterns, negotiate with tribal leaders, navigate by stars, and manage complex logistics across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. Suddenly, their expertise was becoming irrelevant because someone with a ship could accomplish the same thing more efficiently without needing any of those specialized skills. Some merchants attempted to transition into maritime trade, but the learning curve was steep. In the established sea, traders weren't particularly welcoming to competition from former overland specialists. There were touching stories of elderly caravan masters trying to learn nautical terminology and weather patterns, like watching skilled craftsmen trying to adapt to industrial automation technically possible, but emotionally and practically difficult. Historians still debate whether the decline of the overland Silk Road routes was entirely due to maritime competition, or whether it was also influenced by political instability, climate changes, and shifts in consumer preferences. But there's no denying that by 1200 CE, the golden age of caravan commerce was drawing to a close. The most poignant symbol of this transition was the gradual abandonment of the great caravanserais, those magnificent roadside inns that had served as the backbone of overland trade infrastructure. These buildings, which had once bustled with merchants, animals, and goods from across the known world, were slowly becoming empty monuments to a commercial system that was being replaced by ships, sailing routes that ancient merchants had never imagined. As you watch the sun set over Isfahan's still busy but increasingly desperate markets, you can sense the end of an era approaching, the conclusion of a 1,000-year period when the most important roads in the world were made of sand and stone rather than water, and when the greatest merchants were those who could survive the journey as much as those who could negotiate the deals. The great trading routes that had connected east and west for over a millennium were slowly quieting, like a conversation gradually fading as participants drift away to other rooms, other concerns, other ways of connecting across the vast distances that had once seemed so formidable. The merchants and their schemes, their creativity and their deceptions, their brilliant innovations and their spectacular failures. All of it was becoming part of history rather than daily life. You can almost hear the gentle sounds of this ancient world settling into memory, the soft whisper of silk against silk in storage rooms that will soon be converted to other purposes, the distant tinkling of the last camel bells as smaller caravans continue operating between nearby cities, the quiet conversations of merchants who are slowly accepting that the world they knew is transforming into something different, to something they may not fully understand but must learn to navigate nonetheless. The stories you've witnessed of Rostam and his creative silk plans, of those ingenious monks with their hidden silkworm eggs, of Abdurrahman and his imaginary expeditions, of all the clever, desperate, brilliant, occasionally criminal entrepreneurs who built fortunes on creativity and courage. These stories are settling into the comfortable realm of legend, where the details become softer and the moral complexities fade into simpler tales of adventure and human ingenuity. As the night deepens around you, you can feel yourself floating gently away from these ancient markets in their fading bustle, drifting back through time toward your own era, carrying with you the comforting knowledge that humans have always been remarkably creative when it comes to commerce, that every age has its innovators and its opportunities, and that even in the most challenging circumstances, people find ways to adapt, survive, and sometimes even prosper through a combination of determination, imagination, and just a little bit of harmless deception. Sleep well, knowing that the merchants of the Silk Road, with all their schemes and dreams, have found their rest too, and that their stories continue to whisper softly through the night, reminding us that commerce has always been, at its heart, a very human adventure filled with risk, creativity, and the eternal hope that tomorrow's journey will prove more profitable than today's.